Do explain Mind the Gap.
So Mind the Gap is a diagram that I started drawing really about 20 years ago, 21, 22 years ago. I'd been in practice for 2 or 3 years. And what was interesting was I was starting to find that I was seeing young children. I was seeing, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and their parents were bringing them in. And these children were just complaining of being tired, and they were struggling, and they weren't happy, and they were just really, they were fatigued. And at the same time, it was around about a time when a very new school was opening very close to where my practice was. And I'm seeing the children, the parents were bringing the children, and I'm seeing the teachers. And it seemed at a time when things were really gearing up academically. It was a private school. They obviously were looking to set themselves apart from the ordinary government type setup. And that meant a longer school day, and that meant, more subjects and all of these kinds of things. And what was happening was there was just this generalized sense of tiredness and load and pressure. And what I started doing at that point is I wanted people to understand that when load increases, right, if you could picture a gap, right, between a load line, so a line that I drew, two parallel lines that one represented the load that I'm bearing, whether that was personal or social or family or school or whatever else it was work wise, there's this load, and that's going to be carried by something. And that's what I call the support line or the fuel line. And what I was trying to point to was when you look at the actual demands line, that load increasing, and it was almost seemingly increasing exponentially for a lot of people. Typically, what happens is if you could keep the fuel, right, consistent and increase that, you could maintain the gap.
Yes, and
So
carry
exactly,
the
and carry that increased load. And in fact, if you could do that well, it would reach a point where now you're functioning at just a much higher level. There's greater efficiency, there's greater skill, and the performance level is just much, much higher. The problem is the load kept coming. And the natural tendency most people have when the load is coming is not to add the appropriate support and refuel. So I would break it down and I would say, well, when you look at refuel or support, you can have things that are healthy and helpful, and there are things that are instantly rewarding, but not necessarily beneficial. So this would look like this. The healthy things, well, more sleep, more exercise, better diet, more hydration, some sort of stress managing sort of techniques or coping methods versus more alcohol, more caffeine, more tobacco, or whatever else people were going to go ahead and use typically would include less sleep, and all the good things would be substantially reduced. So what would happen is the way I would draw it was there's this increase in demand, and instead of the support keeping up with that to maintain a narrow gap, the support would dip down and the gap would increase very, very quickly. And then I would say, now picture a paperclip. So the paperclip back in the day was something we used quite frequently with patient files and everything. And I would take one and I would sort of straighten it, nice and sharp, and you could scratch something or do whatever else you wanted. And then I would put it back and I would say I could use it again as a paperclip. But if I did that again and again and again, it would start deforming. And at some point when I opened it up, it would break.
right.
And my point was always, it breaks not because I added some massively new force. I just did the same thing. But the same thing on what was fatigued broke it. And the whole point was mind the gap was if we're not careful about how that gap grows with the increasing demand and the reduction in many respects of the support, the reducing of that line and a growing gap, this was what was leading to the kind of probably more clinical fatigue, dysfunctional dysregulation, and then typically a burnout and a breakdown. So that was the whole diagram of mind the gap. And that was the caution. The caution is we need to be careful. So inevitably what I would do with people in that situation was I'd say, as you see this gap widening, what could we do? Is there anything we can do to the top line? And people inevitably say, well, no. I'd say, well, you could quit your job and you could get rid of friends and you could do all of these things and massively diminish the load line. And they'd say like, yeah, I get, but no, and I can't do that. And I say, exactly. I'm mindful of that. I'm not expecting you to go ahead and do that.
Really? They can't
Right.
do anything?
Back then, I'm leaving it at that. The focus was, clinical healthcare, the focus was let me show you how to support what load you have to carry. So that was the focus at that point. My focus was not, well, let me give you advice as to possibly how to manage your load better. I do that much more now. Now I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, well, let's look at load. And in the same way that I had to look at support as being healthy and unhealthy, now I can look at load and say, well, there's healthy load and there's unhealthy load. So where we can look at it and say, I think we could remove these things that are taking my time, my energy, and, sort of my skills and my presence even. If I can find things that are taking that away and it's wasteful, it's unnecessary, or it's not my priority, well, that is with Perspective for Life where the shift has occurred for me. So I have these discussions much more along the lines of, let's look at assessing the load and the impact, and yes, paying attention to these other important components of good sleep and supplements and exercise and all of those kinds of things, because they're all essential for mental health, physical health, and mental energy, which at the end of the day is needed for self-control. The point is, I think, in keeping with the mind map discussion, we were heading towards saying, what's a practical way of making sure we're not adding unnecessary load, when the simple fact is we're quite depleted a lot of the time. So there is this state of tiredness. One of the things that we can do is definitely start addressing that sort of internal dialogue and thought process of, is this worth me giving my time, effort, and attention to? And so that was really the discussion.
Okay, so that was a long one. I could have unpacked many things there, but I'm gonna, whatever sticks now is.
Yeah. Go for it. What comes to mind?
Okay, so there are two components, right? Demand.
Yep.
And then the support line,
Yep.
right? So if I look at demand, obviously that cannot be changed long term. So do I understand you? The first line immediate, we can start discussing how to keep you recharged. Now I can't remove everything overnight. That requires much more consideration in decision making. Work, relationship, parenting, these are heavy gravitational decisions. They really pull a lot of resources when we don't make the right decisions. So I'm guessing before we make that, although they're carrying forward, you enable them to carry while we are discussing what can be improved in each, but you give them to the point that they actually can see better and think better and then come to the table in a better state of mind, if I understand that correctly.
The whole point of the diagram was to show people you cannot afford to neglect the basics. You cannot afford to neglect sleep. You cannot afford to neglect diet. You cannot afford to think you can just cruise along without supporting, possibly with some appropriate supplements, or take a time out. The whole point of the initial diagram was to go ahead and say, you think you can keep going. You think you can keep pushing. You think you can get by on 5 hours of sleep. And you think and you think and you think. I want you to see that it's not possible. That gap will widen and you'll keep going for a period of time, but your functional potential is going to shrink. And as that functional potential shrinks, you're going to have to push more and more. And the default, again, was not to the healthy things. The default is to more caffeine.
But I can see why. I mean, if you are at that state, I mean, the self-care becomes the easiest low-hanging kind of change of consciousness, right? So I want to escape this state as possible. And what is instantaneous? Think about it. I mean, it could be alcohol, it could be food. It's a really dysfunctional self-care, to be honest.
It's a mix.
Yes. So, but I just want to come back to, oops, I lost the thought there.
Okay, well, I'll pick up on that and you come back to it. My apologies for interrupting.
No, because I was just thinking of what you mentioned, and this is strange how people disassociate